We are still the House Ways and Means Committee. We are joined by the House Education Committee. It is some date near the end of January, but I don't remember anymore. It's the 30th. And we're going to finish up our day having a conversation. So I would, I think I framed a couple times this idea of sort of short-term, long-term spectrum between short-term and long-term, revenue options, spending options. Somewhere in the middle is like policy tools that just move responsibility, toggle the responsibility to some other bucket, taxpayers. For short-term options, I just want to name that budgets are like basically currently being warned. And so as we're like the short-term options are more urgent because of that, right? I think I have some nervousness about sort of two different scenarios that I'd love to share with you all. And then I'd love to actually, let's just start with what did people hear on Thursday that is like helpful to put on the room? Because we did not debrief the Thursday hearing with each other. I just said what I sort of heard from the Thursday hearing. So does anyone want to sort of share any reflections from Thursday? It was Thursday that we had the joint hearing, right?
I'll be joint hearing. Okay.
Yeah, that was Thursday. Anyone? Okay, great.
Emily, I'd be happy to start.
Cool. Thanks, Peter.
So I think what was interesting to hear was that, first of all, a lot of the stories were different, but that, we hear a lot of mention of Act 127, and specifically the weighting and how that's affecting tax rates. Yet we heard from folks who basically said, we're kind of neutral, we're kind of in the middle. For us, it's all about ed spending and the things that over which we don't have a lot of control, including sort of the student need that continues to exist without the federal funding to make it happen. So it was educational for me to hear that it's many factors. I'm not saying anything that we haven't all said before, but that for so many districts, it was much more all the other factors than it was pupil weighting that was affecting their tax rates.
Appreciate that.
I think this is aligned with what Peter just said. At the risk of being really basic, it seems like the unifying factor was that everyone's kind of in a similar boat, but that different districts feel the reasons they're in that boat are different and the solutions are therefore different.
I was excited the districts could hear from each other. I didn't go into the hearing with anticipating that. I went into it anticipating what we would hear, and then I really appreciated that they could hear from each other about sort of how different the causes might be, though we are all in that same ed fund boat together. Yeah, Representative.
Yes, and I agree. I think it was really good that they could hear from each other, but even that said, I think the cap, and I wasn't here, as you know, Emily, when this plan was put together. So it's difficult for me to even make a comment, but what seems obvious to me is that cap, that 5% is not working the way it was intended. In fact, it's being a negative, so we ought to ditch it.
Yeah, I agree that cap is not working the way we intended it. Yeah, Scott.
My takeaway was and I completely understand why, just the districts, the disconnect between, they received their weighting change and it has been overpowered by the increase in spending, and they just don't understand how one is taking away what they thought was an advantage. And I understand why it's really complicated, but they don't, not only they don't seem to understand it, but they seem to me like they're putting a foot in the bucket of, they don't trust it, like the whole thing.
I feel really nervous about that idea that like folks are I think we spent a lot of time last year or 2 years ago talking about the relationship between sort of that's educational equity, simplicity, and voter decision making, like local control, and how hard those three things are to balance. And we sort of always lose one of them, and what we lose is simplicity generally in our system. And I feel scared about that sort of eroding the voter decision-making part of the puzzle right now.
To your point about sort of the value of having all that testimony together, I know I heard from a constituent who was listening to testimony and she was like, wow, I've been so immersed in our own little ups and downs and challenges with our own school budget that it's staggering to kind of hear our challenges and the exponential sort of size and scale of the challenges and they all add up together, which I think, is just one of the inherent tensions of this system where there are local decisions made for a yield, as even said, and trying to have a whole system that works together. But it's really hard at the individual level to sort of see how your piece fits into that broader piece. And it creates such complexity and it gives us very limited tools at this point to address some of the system-wide challenges that are driving massive spending.
I'm gonna try not calling on people and see what happens. And we'll just act like we're having a conversation. Let's try it.
I heard a little bit of, okay, we get how the weights are going with equity across the board. And then we got all the spending decisions and then, okay, we can almost bear this. And then CLA is coming in. And that's equity from town to town across the state. So the two, I heard more of the CLA concern on Thursday than the other. And I think close to what I think you were saying, which is when you have equity in a formula, it can feel stressful because it doesn't seem as straightforward. And so then it's tough.
Yeah.
It's tough to explain. It's tough to bear sometimes.
I think there are two pieces of that. One, I think it's sort of that we have these two pieces that are making so many pieces that are making things confusing. I'm nervous that we're going to have an instinct to do something with the CLA to appear politically responsive to people's concerns about the CLA. That at the end of the day, it's going to be sort of mathematically the same as if we hadn't done anything. And I just have like very mixed feelings about behaving that way. And I sort of want to name that for you all publicly. And so like that's sort of one piece. And I think maybe we could tackle that when we're thinking about FY26 rather than FY25. The other thing is I think we haven't spent that much time, like Julia said, it's a nonlinear relationship to us about people waiting, about the 5% and spending and tax rates and how the 5% creates a nonlinear relationship between spending and tax rates. And I don't think we've spent a lot of time talking about how like, it's not just nonlinear, it's actually like circular and iterative.
That's correct.
And how unbelievably confusing that makes it for anyone trying to make those local decisions that Catherine described. And makes it almost impossible if we wind up in a situation where districts' budgets don't pass and they need to lower their spending in order to bring their rate down. It's very possible that we have a lot of districts in the state that actually would not be able to bring their budget down far enough because of this circular nonlinear relationship to ever pass a budget, which would then default to last year's spending, because that's what we have in statute, which would essentially be what they're already spending this year and is in the failed budget. And so taxpayers would have taxes essentially imposed on them that they had rejected.
That's my biggest concern. I think that's the next shoe to fall.
That's one of my top three concerns, yes.
Can you run through that paragraph again that
Yeah.
started with the, what happens if they all fail?
Yeah, okay. So I think there are two scenarios that I'm like top line nervous about right now. One is we have a lot of budgets fail around the state because tax rates are anticipated to be really high based on the December 1st letter. And we know that actually if we don't act, they'll be even higher than the December. I mean, if we act just in a total linear way based on this outlook without doing something else, if we just set the yield that's in the outlook, tax rates would be quite high. There's a high likelihood that they might fail. If budgets fail, that's really like incredibly difficult for communities, especially communities that don't wrestle with it all that often. You know, the distrust that you then start to build between voters and schools and how teachers then feel, not trust, like it's just a terrible emotional experience. But mathematically, because the 5% threshold isn't linear, districts could cut a huge amount from their budgets in an effort to be responsive to taxpayers and still not actually lower their tax rates very much. And so voters won't feel that those school boards and superintendents are being responsive to their rejection of a budget. And if that keeps on happening, we have in statute that budgets default to last year's spending. That's sort of in statute, that if a budget can't pass, they default to last year.
Last year's educational spending is,
Last year's budget, basically,
And I mean,
Which would make their tax rate still.
which would make their tax rate like essentially just as high as the budget that failed in most cases.
And we might be in a scenario where a school, given the cap and all the other factors, might cut 1 to 2 million from their budget and still not move the local tax rate.
Or even half their budget, right? Half their teachers decimate a school.
And still not see relief.
But the,
Yeah.
and I want to point out, there is time between town meeting and July 1st for revote.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Start back where Carol started with the CLA. It's clear to me, listening to it, a number of people, that a lot of folks don't understand how CLA works at all. They don't understand that you can't have Act 60 without some sort of equalization. So we can't just pull it out and expect anything to change because this legislative or whatever you want to call it, statutory impossibility. So the other set of comments, as we heard, had a lot to do with the 5% cap, and your typification of it as circular is exactly the phrase I was looking for. I mean, that's exactly where we are, you know, so. So here we are, of course, you know, it's.
Yeah. I also think there's a scenario where budgets could pass with those fairly high tax rates.
To me,
And what could happen in that scenario is they pass and then we wind up actually having to set the yield, we set tax rates related to the yield higher than in the December 1st letter. Because as we saw today, spending is actually coming in higher than it was in the December 1st letter. And so then budgets pass, but voters wind up with a tax rate that's well in excess of what they voted for. And again, like distrust, you know, and folks really struggling to pay their bills.
This is probably just the wildest, ridiculous question.
Oh, I can't wait.
What if this doesn't work? I don't even want to ask you,
clear it out.
but what if we were
Yeah.
to always set the yield before town meeting day?
Based on.
What would we base it on?
I don't know. I just want to throw out.
Here's what you get.
Risk running a surplus or deficit that.
I mean, we could wind up not raising enough money to cover costs.
well, I'm also concerned that there are many taxpayers who are oblivious to all this. They're not watching us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what's going to happen is they're going to get a tax bill. And then they're going to say, what happened? And they're not going to be paying attention all along. They're not going to understand it. And what happens then? And they react to that. I'm not sure
Especially with the lag issue that's flagged too, right?
if I'm still here.
So like, not only is there the potential for a huge increase this year, but that the income sensitized payment isn't even in line with that. And so they haven't been paying attention, all of a sudden sticker shock and lack of relief. So it seems like figuring out how to maybe at least that's one narrow thing that we can work to address this year.
I think we can definitely address that this year. Okay, yeah, Peter, go ahead.
I, what resonated with me and puzzled me at the same time. Numerous of our guests last Thursday said, I understand quotes, the point behind Act 127. I agree with it. I just don't like how it worked. And I guess I'm reflecting on an observation I made. I don't take particularly pride of ownership. Namely, when the legislature had to grapple with Brigham, it worried more about taxpayer equity in the sense of parity of effort. That's why the tax capacity enters the whole discussion, as opposed to access to educational equity. And yet it's the educational adequacy that's in the Constitution, not tax capacity. So it's sort of an odd change of direction, if you will, that we, the legislature, got. And I think we ought to return to the idea of saying, you know, there's a certain floor rather than the ceiling. If you're going to override local control, you might do it on the floor side, not on the ceiling side, and say, this is what you must do if you're going to run a school in the state of Vermont.
And I think that's, that's what the PICUS study did a decade ago. I think that's what the report that 127 requested of joint fiscal that Julia shared with us last week was getting at. I will name that in 127, we actually did put significant language around education quality standards into that bill. Right. And sort of that side of this conversation really sits much more firmly with our colleagues downstairs. And figuring that piece of it out. And I think you all are you all doing work on sort of tracking the education quality standards and how does that fit into all of this for you?
Well, first of all, figuring out how to unmute, but so in terms of how the language of 127, it is not something that we have addressed, and probably should take this as a reminder that we should. Educational quality standards, are that the ability to enforce them, review them is limited by the capacity of the Agency of Education. But I think you guys have taken a review of 127 from the point of view of the financing, and we should take another look at it from the point of view of those issues as well, to make sure that the education quality standards portion is doing what it's supposed to. Representative Brady, I think, has a question or not.
I guess just my observation and follow up from Thursday is that what I heard, I'm not sure if it was implicitly or explicitly on Thursday, but have heard very explicitly from almost every school leader and organization we've heard from this session is that our educational system lacks any leadership or vision. And we're at a crossroads here. And I think that was really clear on Thursday. And the lack of that vision, compounded with where we are in time after a pandemic, compounded with complex funding changes, is bringing our system of having a statewide education fund and local or the supposed local control over all the decisions into an extraordinary high level of conflict. And I think I also heard some school leaders say, and have heard certainly over the past few weeks, that there's perhaps less, folks feel like they have less local control than we might say or think they do. I think everybody feels a bit out of control about the situation. And so the thing I definitely heard implicitly, not explicitly on Thursday, was that if we are going to do anything here, and make any changes going into this budget season, including budgets that have already been warned, I think we have to be having a pretty big, hard, open conversation about that bigger vision and future, and signaling to the field, some sort of stability, and some sort of sense of the path ahead so that we're not in this place again and again and again the next few years.
Yeah. One thing I also heard that I just want to make sure I say, and I think everyone feels, is just like how hard all of those folks who spoke with us are working every day to navigate this from the very particular seat that they sit in. And how significant the needs are in each of those places for each of those people. And I'm grateful that they can like see above water enough to just even talk to us. So let's see. I hear that we need to focus on the income adjustment for this year. I hear that we need to focus on some efforts at new revenue this year. I think I hear people saying we need to change the cap for this year. Am I hearing that right? Okay. I just want to acknowledge that I think that's like really a significant challenge and hardship for districts, and it's the best case scenario hardship challenge. It's all a hardship and a challenge.
And then in that, we still want to be thinking about transition mechanisms for districts that saw significant changes in with pupils diminishing side.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. Some transition mechanism will still be needed. I think just maybe a more surgical. Yeah, Carolyn, Peter.
Is there anything that you have heard, those of you who've been on the committee for the last few years, from schools that is burdening them down in addition to what we heard on Thursday? Anything that we can get rid of to free teachers up for time-wise during the day to let them teach more and less, less swamped with paperwork, administrative stuff?
I think that's a good question for the education committee. I imagine that you all over there in that room with those beautiful quilts are going to be spending some time thinking about sort of FY26 and beyond spending. And I don't know if that's part of it. I don't know if you heard what Representative Brannigan said.
I didn't hear it quite clearly.
They were, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Asking how we can reduce costs.
Well,
Right.
and within the classroom, within,
So we can
relieve the teachers of some of the burden the legislature has placed on schools that
What
keep them
would
from
be-
teaching.
What would be some of the examples that you would provide that we should be discussing?
Well, I don't even know if they do this. I guess they don't take a hot lunch count anymore, do they? Because a lunch is all free, but whatever tasks they have to do during the day that take up time that takes them away from teaching. Because the way I see it, and you know what? I know this is true. These people are not just new college graduates off the street. They are highly trained professionals that have had tasks over and over again that really hone their skills to make them good when they first enter the classroom. These aren't just people who want to be with kids. These are people who know what they're doing. And I believe that. And after the pandemic, I know there were children who fell behind. My little ones fell behind, my grandchildren. I had a second grader who couldn't read yet. And so there's got to be a way to get around that. These teachers know how to do it if we take some of their burden during the school day away. So whatever is weighting them down, keeping them from teaching, let's get rid of it, at least for a year, and do an experiment.
I guess to respond, I'd say I'm not sure specifically what that might be. I think what we have heard from the field is that the burdens that exist in schools is largely the burden of, one, lack of manpower, unable to hire the people needed to provide the services to students, and two, the high level of need in those students. I'm not sure what we can do to address either of those major issues. What we need to be looking at here is if we're talking about trying to get a control of costs, is what are the structural changes that we need to make to get a handle on a $2.1 billion system that would not only perhaps bend the cost curve, but also provide better services and more opportunity for students. And these are hard decisions, they're hard questions, because in fact, some of the local control that does exist is level of services provided, numbers of adults in schools for kids, and just sort of how each system operates district by district. And, I think if we're going to have a big talk about changes, one of the big philosophies we're going to have to talk about is local control, and how much control comes from the state, how much control comes from the locals, because we operate a very expensive system. There's no doubt about that. And how we get a handle on that is going to also raise a lot of conflict. But in terms of lessening the burden on teachers in schools, I think that does largely come down to adults who can provide the services needed for students and the high needs of students. And I would ask the teachers in the classroom here, and the committee, say, correct me if I'm wrong.
No, I don't think so at all. I think the dilemma that we're going to run into, and that as if we're going to have big, hard conversations is, and I've been one to say it many times recently, a tremendous shift of social services costs into the education fund and into schools. And I think we also have to understand that and be serious about the path forward on that, because schools are often our sort of community place, and they are the place, in the pandemic, they're the place that still delivered food. In a flood, they're the place that's still open. Like, they are still those things. So do we need to think about some of the funding differently, and accept that schools are playing a larger and larger kind of social services role, and sometimes in very, very thoughtful ways. We've got awesome work happening in some community schools, some big grant winners in our state that really, I think, show us sort of a positive model. It doesn't answer your question, Representative Brannigan, other than how do we resource schools appropriately to deal with the children that they have. Schools have to serve the kids who are in front of them, and that's what they're doing. And it's all hands on deck.
I had a conversation over the weekend actually with a constituent who's a teacher, and we were talking about the community schools grant, and she was like, when are we going to get that down here? And I think it's really interesting, like, if most of our schools are serving as community schools unofficially, what does it take to actually acknowledge that, and really be designing our funding around it in a more explicit way? But again, that's your job, not ours.
Isn't it both our job?
Yeah, but you're gonna have to lead on that one, on the design, because you don't want us like deciding what a community
really
school
don't.
looks like.
I just would like to follow up on the community school thing, because it's something that we have had little discussions and debates out here. It's a great program. It works. It's showing great results, but it is essentially giving schools money to provide social services that they weren't originally designed to provide. So you sort of say, well, aren't we essentially, by having community schools, acknowledging that schools are the folks that have to provide these services because they're sort of the service of last resort?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, Peter.
Okay, thanks. One of the things that Julia reminded me, one of the variations on if you push on the balloon, et cetera, reminded me of a anecdotal observation, namely the differential effect of the CLA mirroring different classes of property in terms of their increase. And I'm thinking about the difference between homestead and non-homestead. I doubt that they both have increased at the same rate of value in this rush in the real estate market. And so I'm more attracted, frankly, to the version that Julia presented, which said, you know, we did this by habit to have the two rates go up by the same percentage, but there's nothing that frankly that would prevent us from saying, let's see if the anecdotal has any rigor to it and figure out what it is that the homestead rate went up higher in the last real estate boom compared to the non-homestead and sort of say, okay, well, can't we mirror that in terms of the two rates instead of just automatically knee-jerk raise them by the same percentage, which I'm not sure satisfies anybody, frankly. Yeah.
Way back a while ago, before we settled on trying to move them up equally, there was a time when Ways and Means played with them back and forth to try to achieve one outcome or another. But it was without a particular methodology, it was trying to achieve an outcome.
And that's what I would argue, some more insight into the two classes in terms of how the CLA has moved, puts some rigor and guardrails around that.
Or otherwise, if we had a rationale, we might have come up with something different.
I mean, I think it's just really hard without the definition of non-homestead that we've been looking for, and why we passed H 480, that, you know, we're talking about deer camp, the general store, and the second home, and they may all move differently, and it's hard to make generalizations because we don't have a level of specificity, and so that does, I think, unfortunately, limit some of our tools right now.
Excitingly, the CLA will actually have less of an effect, even if we don't do anything with it, once 480 is fully implemented, because we would be appraising more regularly.
Right.
I think you just, you were sort of summarizing some of the things that you heard us say, and I want to make sure that on that list is, and you've said it a bunch, so I'm sure it's on that list. We're talking about some immediate actions to address challenges that we're seeing for this year, but we're also maybe really interested in a longer term conversation about how do we make structural changes to be in better places and for that difficult conversation as well.
Yeah. So I definitely heard, but we still have to have a transition mechanism for the prior overweighted districts and maybe a more surgical approach. Yes. But I want to add now that we don't know what more we might need to protect in addition to that. And because we don't have enough data to know. So I still would think we would want to have a pressure valve for relief for school districts where we don't know fully that there will be needs, so that they could still go to the tax rate review committee.
Interesting. And then I guess I would ask you to sort of think over the next few days what the tax rate review committee would do if we were making the transition mechanism much more surgical.
Something to the surgical list.
Oh, that's interesting. Huh.
It just maybe things we don't know. We have no idea.
I will say, I think we're much closer to having some solid data, given that AOE recently froze the this year's pupil counts. Also, while I am talking, just wanna, I made a mistake in speaking earlier. It's not 100% if the budgets fail, it's 87%. So, sorry.
85.
So if budgets fail, you move forward with.
You actually are, it's
85,
actually, I think it's 87, but we will have someone else. Everyone's nodding around the room who knows more than I do about this, and it's 87. Thank you. Thanks, team. Thanks all for not jumping out and correcting me. It's very polite of you. You're welcome to do it more strongly next time. 87%, and it's actually borrowing until something can be warned, until something can pass. So if nothing ever passes, it's unclear what would ever happen.
Say that again.
It's borrowing because you don't actually have your voters have not over approved a budget, so you're borrowing towards the 87.
Okay.
We can look at that with legislative council instead of me just talking off the top of my head with support from the peanut gallery next time.
I'm sorry, but you said AOE just froze per pupil costs?
No, counts.
Yeah, that's what I thought you said, so.
The people counts, the number of students who are in each weighting category.
Well, or imagine.
They were able to do that because what, was that an artificial freeze or what was that?
It's like they finished counting and so the data set is frozen.
Okay, they finished counting.
Yeah, like they counted and then there was lots of like, wait, this number might be wrong from districts as people all looked at the data. Because sometimes lots of people have to look at data to have accurate data. Did I summarize that well, Nicole? Do you want to explain how you froze the counts? I'm so sorry. And you might have not been listening, which is also fine. No. I was describing the process which led to you freezing the pupil counts.
We actually worked till the last issue was resolved, with each of the districts and then froze them. So because it's so important, we, have a extremely small margin. It's actually less than 5 pupils, otherwise we do not freeze. Even with the number we have for 42,000. So I don't know if I'm exactly answering the question.
I think you are. And it's that you froze the data set. It's not like you froze the children, right?
We did not freeze the children.
And some people count as 1.4 children.
Yes.
So.
Do we have an idea of if we go outside the education fund, how much of an infusion it would take to reduce the tax rate by a certain amount? Is that a linear thing or is it probably not?
With the cap, it is a deeply nonlinear relationship. And I think Julia talked a little bit about that last week or the week before. We could ask her to come sit back down and explain it again. There's also a report, interestingly, that JFO just released about a few years ago. There was a little sort of swapperoo of revenue sources between the general fund and the ed fund. Sales tax was attributed to the ed fund at that point. That was before Brigham passed. And sort of like hot take on the ed fund did really well from that swap. And if folks want to look at that report, it's an interesting one. If you're really geeky. Ed committee, what did you want to, the ed committee had their hand up for a second.
I think you first meant to say Wayfair, not Brigham, right?
Yes, I did. Thank you. I meant Wayfair. Excuse me.
Representative Williams has either a question or a comment.
Well, it's more of a comment, but there is a question in there. As I see it, we are spending a lot of money in the schools to help take care of our children. That's not a bad thing. We're spending a lot of money in daycare, childcare, after school to take care of our children. That's not a bad thing. But what are we doing for and with the parents to help them be more involved? Now, maybe this is at the local level, but I think we need to own some of that responsibility to get them more involved and help them be more a part of the process so that they're not sitting at home saying, well, you took this away from us. Now what are you going to do about it? Let's bring it back and let's make it a united front for everyone. That's my opinion.
Appreciate that. I often wonder if what we're doing isn't more a reaction to, two parents working. So therefore we need after-school care. Two parents working, so we need increased childcare.
And I respect that. And yes, and that's why it's okay to put money in these other places. But I also hear parents feel like they have lost the ability to be a part of the process. Even if they can't engage in the actual activity type thing, hear them and have them be a part of the decision making, or hear what they feel isn't working. I know they need to work, not always in my opinion, how I feel about that, but keep them involved, and I think we've lost that. I think that's the part.
Thank you. Representative Austin has a question or comment.
So I'm under the assumption that this is not just a 1-year issue.
Agreed.
And it's unsustainable. You know, it's just with lowering student population. I'm just wondering, I know we have to like probably look at this year, but I'm wondering what, you know, what is our vision for the next 10 years, you know, in public education in Vermont, so we can adapt to, you know, lowering student enrollments and not have our costs continue to increase. Because I think it's for the public that, you know, they've been looking at our student enrollment go down and nothing has changed with the spending.
Right. I think, you know, that goes to what Representative Brady was saying earlier, that short-term fixes have to go hand in hand with a long-term look at
Right.
about how we do this.
Right. And our role has always been to educate students academically. You know, and I know there's mental illness and things that get in the way of a kid learning, but I mean, I don't know if we need to, you know, just look at can we get, you know, a little bit back to what our original charge was in terms of education.
I think that, you know, I sort of laid this out at the beginning. We have a short-term project for this year. And we have a longer-term and medium-term project. And in both cases, we need to think about revenues and we need to think about what will it take to make sure we have a efficient, effective, high-quality education system. So that, you know, we have quality schools and quality learning and resources are being used as effectively as possible. And I think a lot of the time when systems, whether that's a bureaucracy or an individual school or an individual family, are under chronic stress and pressure, such as the pandemic, it's very hard to put your head above water enough to sort of restructure systems or even, you know, reestablish a filing system, let alone like, you know, have vision. And so I think it's very natural that we are in the place that we are in and very logical, but it's still going to take a lot of effort to figure out what next steps look like together. And I do think it's something that we're all going to have to do together, you know, the people at both of these tables and everyone sitting around the room and everyone at each school and district and town around the state, if we're going to make a difference on this. So I'm going to go back to my summarizing activity for a minute. So I hear folks thumbs up on changing the transition mechanism for this year, even acknowledging how difficult that's going to be. And we're going to need a more surgical approach, possibly with a release valve attached to it of some kind. We're going to need to look at the income adjustment for this year to make sure, we're going to need to look at revenue options for this year. And we're going to need to make sure that's all packaged with like a close look at how education is structured going forward, how we spend on education going forward. And school constructions is sort of a key part of that we're not going to lose track of and do more on this week. Did I sort of miss any key highlights here? Okay. I think with that, I'd love to end on a high note. Does that work for everyone? Okay, that's great. Low note, whatever it is, I'm just gonna end. I don't need to describe the ending. Thanks, everyone. Ed committee, we'll see you on Thursday. Thanks for working together on this.
Thank you.